and good evening. I'm Aisha Sindhu and you are watching Gravitas, the show where we dig deep into the headlines and get you perspectives on the big stories of the day. On the show tonight, the winds of privatization could be blowing in the corridors of India's oldest airlines, Air India. Is the Maharaja getting a makeover? We'll get to that in just a bit, but first, on tonight's big discussion, President Donald Trump has spoken and spoken in his inimitable style. Candid, brazen and shocking. Inevitably, his first full-length television interview as president has invited responses, reactions and even protests from many parts of the world. We start by looking at President Trump's midweek shockers for the world. Now, to decode some of those verbal volleys and make sense of them, we are joined in the studio by Pramitpal Chaudhary. He is the foreign editor of Hindustan Times. Joining me live from the United States is Glenn Carl, a writer and former CIA officer who has served 23 years in the clandestine services of the agency and working in a number of overseas posts on 4 continents and, of course, in Washington, D.C. as well. And also joining in is WION's U.S. Bureau Chief, Giles Gibson, who is in D.C. too. Thanks, everyone, for joining in on that conversation. Let's start with that big discussion. So, to get it all started, let's in fact first listen in to what Donald Trump has had to say.
President Obama and Hillary Clinton and Kerry have allowed tens of thousands of people into our country. The FBI is now investigating more people than ever before having to do with terror. And it's from the group of people that came in. So look, our country has a lot of problems. Believe me, I know what the problems are, even better than you do. They're deep problems. They're serious problems. We don't need more.
Let me ask you about some of the countries that won't be on the list. Afghanistan, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia.
You're going to see. We're going to have extreme vetting in all cases. And I mean extreme. And we're not letting people in if we think there's even a little chance of some problem. We are excluding certain countries, but for other countries, we're going to have extreme vetting. It's going to be very hard to come in. Right now, it's very easy to come in. It's going to be very, very hard. I don't want terror in this country.
Okay, for my first question, I'm going to go across to Glenn. Glenn, what do you make of this quote-unquote extreme vetting that Trump is talking about? Do you feel that it's even possible to carry something like that out?
Well, it sounds tough. Everything that Donald Trump utters sounds very tough and macho. I mean, he's like the guy at the construction site talking to be the big man. But it's fundamentally an empty statement with one possible exception. Already, and for many years, under President Obama, under President Bush before him, and in fact always, there have been very rigorous examinations of all people coming to the United States. Are there errors? Have there been? On one tragic occasion, yes. But to change the methods really is an empty statement. So already there are background checks by all the intelligence agencies. We always inquire of our foreign liaison partners about someone from their country as they come in. So the standards are high. Now, can he restrict entrance to the United States? Will he? I think yes is the answer to both of those questions. Will it make a material difference in the number of terrorists? No, because the fact is, despite the claims that Trump continues to make and that many people believe, there are very few terrorists in general and very few who go into the United States. Will there be mistakes? Probably yes. Is it worth stopping all immigration and all foreign entries in entire countries and characterizing an entire religion? Clearly the answer is no, if one is rational.
I'm going to ask Pramit to react to that because, I mean, Glenn pointing out there that this could be, empty threats. Does it really come to anything to do something like that? The vetting process for the United States is already fairly strong. So let's have you react to that.
No, I mean, I think that's correct. I think a lot of what Trump does is to play up often existing policies of the U.S. government and make it sound like that he is going to do that somehow more in a more intense manner than his predecessors. But the fact is that if you are, and the 7 countries he's mentioned, If I'm correct, 5 of them are in some form of civil war or another. So,
Right.
you know, countries like Yemen, Libya, Syria, these are countries where vetting is extraordinarily difficult because often there's no government on the other side to provide documentation. So those countries automatically getting a visa, somebody in those countries trying to get a visa to the United States or to, in fact, almost any major country in the world is extremely difficult. The only country that was unusual among the 7 that he hit was Iran.
All
Because
right.
that is a country that is perfectly stable, has a long-standing political structure, and as far as I know, never actually carried out a terrorist attack against the United States, at least on American soil, though there may have been attacks against American interests elsewhere. And so there is a country that is actually making a foreign policy strategic choice by trying to further isolate Iran, a country that he's already expressed.
What about Pakistan?
Well, Pakistan is a country that also already goes through extreme vetting anyway. A Pakistani who applies for a visa simply because of the sheer number of terrorists who live in Pakistan and the number of terrorist groups that are there. While Pakistanis do get visas, from what I understand, it takes as much as 2 to 3 years if it's somebody who does not have proper documentation. Or
Okay.
in some cases, the rejection rate is quite high.
Okay. Glenn, Pramit Pal brought up, those 7 countries. Do you think that's going to help him achieve this safe country agenda that Trump is harping on?
No, not at all. It will achieve him appearing tough to the people who like to hear tough talk, and those are the people who elected him. Beyond that, it will have no material effect other than possibly keeping out entire populations of various nations. If you have a blanket denial, then you can do that. I did consular work myself 30 years ago and more recently, and the rule of thumb is if there is any doubt, you keep the person out. Yeah. It's not an easy process to obtain a visa. And the fact is that there were never, with the exception of the attack of September 11, Al-Qaeda members who entered the United States. It is not easy to do, and the United States is rigorous.
Right. Anyone who's gone through TSA will, of course, attest to something like that. But Pramit, when it comes to what he's talking about in terms of Europe, that European countries like Germany have made huge mistakes by allowing millions of refugees to come in. And, he's harped on the fact that those are errors that Europe has made. Do you think that there is some amount of how do I put it, that this has added to Europe's security problems, that he is correct in that assessment?
Well, as you know, we've had at least one case, which was the big Paris attack, where we believe one refugee, an IS fighter pretending to came in through the refugee corridor. But so far, the vast bulk of attacks, Islamicist attacks, at least in Europe, have been done by Muslims who are already residents or often citizens of the countries they live in. So far, very few refugees have. It's almost certainly true that the decision by Germany in particular to open the doors to roughly 1 million refugees to a country like Syria, in which you really had no idea half the time who was coming in because documentation was so poor. And a lot of people who came in were not even Syrians. You had Afghans and Pakistanis coming in. Was a remarkable act, a humanitarian act, but in security terms is probably not the smartest thing to have done. Europe will anyway, by all accounts, when I've talked to European security officers, believe that they will have a slowly increasing number of Islamic attacks on their country, not just because of the crisis, because of the instability in the area that they live in, but also because of the fact that the unemployment and, should we say, marginalization of working class Muslims in their country has been continuing, partly because Europe's economies are simply not growing.
Right.
And they have an additional problem that recruitment and of people or people who are spreading jihadi ideology, who are often, again, European citizens.
Right.
The numbers of those are increasing. In fact, we'll see a large number coming out of jail in the next couple of years. So the refugee issue adds a little bit to that problem. But I think when I've talked to American intelligence and security officers, their bigger concern is not the refugees, but European Muslims who already have European citizenship.
Who can easily come into the United States.
Because a lot of them do not require visas to
Right.
enter the United States.
So, and really speaking, there's not any effective way of
well, the
dealing
visa is not a barrier to that, but the
right.
visa is a very small part of that game. You have to, the preemptive intelligence requirement is really about monitoring them before they even get to the stage of getting on the aircraft. But I remember at one time I was talking with a group of American intelligence officers, and they said that, right, British Pakistanis were a core problem about 3 or 4 years ago. What they called them BritPaks, because they were British citizens who had become radicalized, but did not require a visa to come to the United States.
Right. All right. So as we're breaking down the rhetoric, it seems like some of these, ideas that Mr. Trump has put forward in that interview have seem more like empty talk and maybe not things that he can see through. But there's already a tremendous amount of consternation among minorities, even within the United States, on Trump's stand. Let's listen into some of those reactions we've been hearing.
It's a tragedy. I mean, though, especially the refugees, what they have been going through, and they are looking for a place where they can be free, coming out of persecution and things like that. And now where would they go? And America, they look up to America for every help they can get. And so that's my heart. I mean, looking at the situation in Syria, and then they are not even allowed to come to USA, where I mean, there are other countries they can go, but USA is the land of dreams, and the dreams comes true here. So it's sad. It's really sad.
We're not seeing any level of anxiety or people are worried, but people are just disappointed that these are not really aligned with what we believe to be the American values.
Let's get WION's Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief in on the conversation on that. Giles, there seems to be disappointment even within the country on Trump's approach to the issue of migrants. Is that the sense that you're also picking up on?
Yeah, that's right, Aisha. I think it depends, obviously, which sort of parts of the country you speak to. But clearly, in terms of Donald Trump supporters, they're listening to this narrative, really, which Donald Trump and his team are making, that illegal immigration, that immigration policy is directly linked to how you crack down on terror. But clearly the critics of these policies will say that many of these attacks that have been going on US soil, if you look at the San Bernardino attack, for example, these are being carried out by people who are already in the country, who are already US citizens. So the critics really would say that by cracking down on immigration, you're not necessarily cracking down on terror within the United States.
Sure. Pramit, even when you look at some of these attacks, they've also been carried out by people who've come back from Iraq, from Afghanistan. People suffering from PTSD have also carried out some of these attacks. When Donald Trump makes statements like these, does this fall into his whole, posturing of taking the bull by the horns and really playing to the gallery? But it seems to be working.
Yes, I think almost all of the executive orders that he has issued since he has come to office have largely been symbolic. So on Obamacare, he has signed an executive order that basically says that federal agencies should try not to help Obamacare policies. But it's legislated, so there's not much he can do about it until he actually overturns the legislation.
Right.
He's saying that I don't mind waterboarding, and I think torture could actually be useful. And Senator John McCain intervened and said, but there's a law against it. I mean, as long as the law is there, it doesn't really matter what Mr. Trump says. The border, the wall on Mexico, again, he says that federal funds will be aimed at the planning and design of such a wall. What does that mean? Because, again, Congress would have to sanction the $30–40 billion that would cost, but there's no evidence that Congress would necessarily do so. So you have a lot of symbolic actions, and it's interesting, a survey that's been taken in America, those Americans, largely from the working class constituency that supported him, or the core of his base, who don't read mainstream media or listen to mainstream media, when asked what did they think of Trump's first few weeks in office, they said that he's done a great job.
Right.
And those who actually read the media or follow media and have actually read the criticisms or dissection of what he's actually done have said, well, as you said, he's been playing to the gallery, but he actually hasn't done anything of any substance.
So, Glenn, would you say then, going off of what Promit just brought to the table, that this is possibly following the same script and storyline as his campaign as well, with liberals on the coast saying that there's no way Trump can win based on the sort of promises he's making, but middle America really waking up and saying, well, you know, this is the man who's taking our agenda to the White House, and they seem to be responding well to what's happened in the first week of his presidency as well?
But broadly speaking, yes, I think your colleague and I are in complete agreement. My father was involved in politics all his life, and he taught me when I was a young man an unfortunately tragic lesson about politics, which I always resisted, but of course he was right, which is that in politics, if you explain, you lose. If you assert and say categorical things and appear strong, then you tend to win. And that's what's happening with Donald Trump and all of his gestures and his rhetoric. Unfortunately, now I must explain. What he's done cleverly, really, is to conflate, to combine three very separate issues with regard to terrorism, Muslims, and immigration.
Right.
The steps he take will not affect the number of terrorists, but he is tarring an entire group with the appearance of a menace posed to Americans, which factually doesn't exist. The numbers are astounding, actually. Of 1 million refugees, I can't remember the precise numbers, it's 0.0001% of them have engaged in some sort of terrorist-related behavior. It's infinitesimally small. But what happens in America, and everywhere, frankly, is after 9/11, after a terrorist attack conducted by someone who says, Allahu Akbar, what literally happens is that random Americans will go out and beat up some Sikhs because, you know, they're all the same.
Right.
And to explain that Sikhs are not Muslims is irrelevant to this subpart of the population, which likes the gestures.
Right. So, Glenn, you know, both you and Promit have given us so much to talk about, and that is something that, you know, you have to give to Donald Trump. He always gives you, you know, meat to dissect, and we've got a lot more to talk about, but I'm going to thank Giles Gibson first before we go ahead. I'm going to ask both Promit and Glenn to stay with us, but Giles, thanks so much for bringing us that perspective from DC and from the ground. We're going to go a little further on the program now, because the last president, Barack Obama, had said that America does not stand for torture, but clearly President Trump seems to differ from that line. Here are his thoughts on waterboarding.
You're now the president. Do you want waterboarding?
I don't want people to chop off the citizens or anybody's heads in the Middle East, okay? Because they're Christian or Muslim or anything else. I don't want, look, you are old enough to have seen a time that was much different. You never saw heads chopped off until a few years ago. Now they chop them off and they put them on camera and they send them all over the world. So we have that, and we're not allowed to do anything. We're not playing on an even field. I will say this. I will rely on Pompeo and Mattis and my group. And if they don't want to do, that's fine. If they do want to do, then I will work toward that end. I want to do everything within the bounds of what you're allowed to do legally. But do I feel it works? Absolutely, I feel it works.
Okay, so he thinks that works. Glenn, how big a worry for the United States is Trump's now very open support for waterboarding and torture?
Well, these are, in this instance, even if they are never given the force of law, they are hideous statements and very dangerous and harmful. They have already caused harm. The laws are very clear, but I lived what happens to good men and women of principle, when there is an order from your superior, from the chief executive. I was told, do whatever it takes. I responded, that's against the law. And the answer was, the president says it's okay. I was the equivalent of a lieutenant colonel. I had just been told the president, secretary of defense, Department of Justice, and so on, all had ordered this. It's very difficult to resist that. Many things happen without there being a written record. So if the chief executive presses for something, unfortunately, he will probably find people who are willing to go around the procedures that are formally accepted and do what they are ordered to do. So it's very harmful. And not only is it harmful on a legal point, but he does not have any idea what he is talking about. It sounds tough. It is tough. It sounds impressive to impose your will on someone. But that's not how you obtain good information. That's not how you protect your own people who are in harm's way. It's counterproductive, which is a euphemism for it's very dangerous and harmful to ourselves without achieving what he wants to achieve, which I do too, which is to destroy Islamic terrorism.
Ramit, just putting all of this in perspective, it seems like Donald Trump is making a commitment to fighting fire with fire. He's denouncing the IS's, actions in the Middle East, but he's also talking about, torture and waterboarding, things that have been considered against the rights of citizens. Yep. But do you feel that this is sort of like a competition, and going off of what Glenn said, that this is his way of putting his agenda forth, and it works? Yeah,
I'll just say he didn't say torture citizens. I think U.S. citizens would be considered a little beyond thing. But yes, but what he has done, a very basic thing which a lot of people on the ground would believe, which is that the Islamic State, because it has fighters who are willing to blow themselves up and who are so brutal, automatically has an edge over a liberal democratic structure. The point is that the number one reason I always argue with people like that about torture is all the evidence indicates that it actually doesn't help you get any information. That the vast bulk of people, if you torture them, will tell you whatever they want, whatever you want them to, just to stop the pain.
Right.
And there's a huge amount of evidence on this, that torture is actually one of the worst ways to get information, and that in fact co-opting and being friendly to a person is one of the much easier and more successful ways to get information. And if you look at the record, for example, of American interrogation of members of Al-Qaeda, people like al-Libi and so on, provided a lot more information because they were turned. They were basically befriended, persuaded that what they were doing was incorrect or not, and just learned to bond humanly with their interrogator rather than being taken and tortured. So that's one of the, I think, the fundamental pragmatic reason why torture doesn't work. There is, of course, as has been correctly mentioned, there's a moral issue that a country that ultimately, a political system that's of core philosophy is the Bill of Rights and an independent judiciary, so on and so forth, that this ultimately undermines severely, because what happens in every time a country, where any democracy, including India and the United States, every time we have gone down this path, it almost always has to be done in a manner that subverts the basic systems of governance. You have to walk around away from the judiciary, you have to walk around the rule of law, you have to walk around the legislative process. And every time it's eventually found, the people involved end up being arrested, and there's normally a scandal that breaks out.
Right.
And it's not just in the question of torture. It's, for example, the Iran-Contra scandal that rocked the Reagan administration, where you had an entire arm of the government trying to run an independent foreign policy in violation of the laws of the country. Nobody died, nobody was tortured, but eventually it resulted in a scandal because it had to do the same thing. It had to go around and around the system. We have the same problem in India with encounter deaths, for example, where it may take a little while longer, but 10 years later there's a scandal.
It does crop up.
And it pops up. It's almost inevitable that it will eventually come out. And the net result is the people involved end up going to jail, the police system is discredited, and there's normally a lot of problems. But again, the fundamental issue is that if you eventually look at it and you ask yourself, okay, for all of this mess, what did we actually get in practical terms? The answer is almost very
Nothing.
little.
Okay. So whether you believe it or not, that just talking about his views on refugees and of course on waterboarding, that wasn't really all that Donald Trump spoke about. Let's move on a little bit further into some of those other statements that he's making. Now, all through his campaign, it was one of his favorite subjects, and that of voter fraud. Now that he is in charge, he wants to get to the bottom of it. Here's what Donald Trump had to say on voter fraud.
What's going on with voter fraud is horrible. That's number one. Number two, I would have won the popular vote if I was campaigning for the popular vote. I would have gone to California, where I didn't go at all. I would have gone to New York, where I didn't campaign at all. I would have gone to a couple of places that I didn't go to. And I would have won that much easier than winning the Electoral College. But as you know, the Electoral College is all that matters. It doesn't make any difference. With that being said, if you look at voter registration, you look at the dead people that are registered to vote, who vote, you look at people that are registered in 2 states, you look at all of these different things that are happening with registration, you take a look at those registration, you're going to find, and we're going to do an investigation on it.
But 3 to 5 million illegal votes.
Well, we're going to find out, but it could very well be that much.
Okay, I have time for 2 very quick reactions from both my guests before we head into a break. So I'll go to Glenn first. Glenn, it's so apparent that Donald Trump hasn't come to terms with the fact that he lost the popular vote. Is there an agenda that he's pushing now, still talking about it once he's attained the presidency?
Well, Donald Trump does have one consistent agenda, and that is to draw all attention to himself and aggrandize himself. If that doesn't happen in every instance by an organization or an individual, then he becomes enraged. The evidence from all of the attorneys general and organizers and people who run state elections, the elections in every state, is that there isn't voter fraud of any sort whatsoever. He's conflating, once again, confusing issues so that he has wiggle room by stating that there are numbers of voters who have died who remain on the rolls and have not been removed. That is true, but the dead people have not voted. They just have not. And so he's making actually no sense aside from trying to make himself sound greater than the facts actually show.
Okay.
Look, when the constituency that voted him into office, white working class males in particular, often many of them who feel marginalized within their own country, partly because of their economic consequences, have built a narrative, as happens with most marginal groups in society, that often has a degree of conspiracy built into it, that we are in this position because certain forces that are invisible are working against us. Trump has very carefully played on a lot of this. He feeds into that narrative. And for me, I'm not particularly surprised because a lot of politicians do exactly this. They do it in India, they've done it in Europe. And so that's not for me. For me, the real question of Trump is not going to be statements like this. The real measure of the man is going to be not statements like this, but really, is he going to be able to carry out real policies while he may be feeding into this narrative for his constituency? And I think, for example, one of the decisions he made to reverse the ban on the Keystone XL pipeline,
right, yes,
that is going to actually be part of a larger fossil fuel boom that he is trying to push by reducing environmental regulations, putting in people like Rick Perry and Tillerson, who are both energy people, into America, and then saying we have this huge amount of oil, gas, and perhaps even coal, and we are going to drive American fossil fuel production. This will create, Keystone itself will create about 15,000 jobs, at least for the construction phase. This will create a huge economic boom within America.
Sure.
And in many ways, a lot of this, what he's going to be doing on those fronts, in my view, is going to be really what American voters will measure him by.
Okay.
A lot of this may disappear, but the real policies are what we're going to have to look out for in the next few months.
All right. So we are going to do that, of course, here on WION, but we're going to take a quick break right now. When we come back, we're going to talk about Peña Nieto, the Mexican border wall, and who's going to pay for it. Stay tuned.